Greetings, Earthlings! Welcome back to 7th Street, and welcome to finally another Top 5 video. It's been a long time since I've done one of these. But anyway, anyone who knows me knows that I cannot stand remakes. Of any kind, not just horror movies, sci-fi movies, genre films, I mean anything at all, like the new Aladdin remake, and the Lion King remake, the Beauty and the Beast remake. I think they're all garbage. There's no need for remaking films, especially when the originals are so good. You know, recently Pet Sematary came out, and I called it. I knew it was gonna be shit. The new Chapter 2 for Stephen King's It is gonna come out. The first one was decent. I don't know if I would necessarily say it's better than the original, or even comes close. It still just felt unnecessary. If the original film is so great, why would you remake it? What's the point? You know, the new Suspiria movie was absolutely garbage. The new Halloween movie, although it's sort of a sequel to the first one, it still felt like a reboot. There are even a bunch of reboots that I've never seen, never want to see, and I don't give a shit about them, so I'll never see them. But there are certain cases where there are good remakes. It's very few and far in between, but it does happen. So I thought we would take a look at 7th Street Productions' top 5 favorite horror remakes.
Can you stand the intense horror, the explicit action, the gruesome gore?
Okay, coming in at number 5 is Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead. Not a perfect movie by any means, not even necessarily a good retelling of Dawn of the Dead. Does it come anywhere near the original Dawn of the Dead? No, not at all. Not even close. Can't hold a candle. But it is surprisingly good. It's a really fun movie. It's very action-packed. In fact, it feels mostly like an action movie with zombies in it, and a few good scare scenes, I would say. You know, all around, this was one that was really surprising for me, even when I first saw it. I was in 6th grade, and I begged my dad to take me to this movie, and him and my mom, they were really apprehensive about it. But, you know, I had been watching horror movies, you know, all the time, like, you know, why can't you guys take me to this movie? And my dad ended up taking me and my cousin Cameron to go see it. He even got heckled by some people behind us in line when he bought the tickets. I can vividly remember the voice of this guy being like, "You're gonna take your kids to see Dawn of the Dead?" But we went and we watched it, and it was great. It was, like, exhilarating. I, even as a 12-year-old, expected to really hate this movie. You know, the original Dead trilogy were, like, you know, my gold standard, still are my gold standard. But even when I was 12 years old, I mean, I was absolutely nuts over these movies. So I really didn't expect it to be as good as it was. And it really was. You know, I think that Zack Snyder is a pretty underrated director, especially genre film director. I think that time will look back on Zack Snyder pretty well, pretty favorably, especially among the horror crowd. Of course, the original Dawn of the Dead is about 4 survivors who sort of band together. They chopper into this shopping mall, and the shopping mall is completely inhabited by zombies, and they go through and they, you know, clean out the mall. They have this big battle with all the zombies and end up locking the doors, and then they have everything. They have, like, this temple to consumerism, you know, and even though the apocalypse is happening outside, they have, like, you know, the most amazing situation that anyone could ever hope for if you're, like, a materialistic person. And then, of course, some bikers roll through and they want to take the place for themselves, and they let the zombies in, and it's kind of a commentary about greed and consumerism, and, you know, the trajectory of, you know, society at that time coming out of Vietnam, and, everyone's just doing disco and cocaine and malls are being built. Like, isn't the world great again? And it's a beautiful movie. This has none of that. It has absolutely none of it. And even at the time, as a 12-year-old, I knew that going in. And I really wondered what they were going to do with that, if they were going to try to have any sort of message at all. And luckily for them, they decided not to. They knew exactly what this was. This was just an action-filled bloodbath zombie romp. It's got a really good cast in it. I really like Sarah Polley. I forget the actor's name, but he, I think, is probably most well known for Modern Family now. He's really funny in it. I mean, they have just such a good little ensemble of a cast. You even have Matt Frewer, who, if you don't know, is the original Max Headroom. He's in the movie. It's all around fun. It's surprisingly fun. So if you haven't seen it, definitely give it a watch. It's nowhere near the original Dawn of the Dead. I don't think anyone ever expected it to be, but it's a good popcorn flick, good zombie movie. At number 4 on my list, I have David Cronenberg's The Fly, starring Jeff Goldblum, who is amazing in this movie. I mean, I don't know how everyone else feels about this role, but I always consider this to be his best character that he's ever played in a movie. Of course, this is the David Cronenberg remake of a 1950s movie that starred Vincent Price, that, has basically the same plot. A scientist who's working on, transferring matter through teleportation, and when he's testing it on himself, a housefly gets in there and his DNA gets mixed with it. In the 1950s one, the scientist comes out of the chamber immediately with a fly head and a fly claw, and the movie operates more of like a mystery. He keeps himself disguised and shrouded, and the wife is trying to figure out exactly what happened to him, and then he's able to leave her messages, and it's more of a mystery. David Cronenberg is obviously very well known for doing body horror films. He kind of flips the plot a little bit more on its head, with Jeff Goldblum going in, getting his DNA mixed with a fly, and then he's slowly turning into a fly. His body parts are falling off, and he's keeping them in his bathroom in the cabinet. And he's just very slowly taking on the traits of a housefly. He starts to be able to crawl up the walls, and he's vomiting acid vomit to so that he can eat. And it's just kind of this nightmarish film with this guy falling apart. And then at the end, just kind of like in the 50s one, it's only really in the end that you get this fly humanoid monster. But the payoff in David Cronenberg's is probably quite a bit better. Is The Fly better than the original? Is David Cronenberg's The Fly better than the original? In my mind, no. I have a really big soft spot for The Fly. I obviously love Vincent Price. I saw this movie at a really young age. I remember my dad telling me about the scene with the person being eaten by the spider in the garden. And I always really liked the 1950s version and its sequels. But I can certainly see why someone would prefer the David Cronenberg version. It's better. It's obviously has better effects. It arguably has better acting. And it's just, although the basic plot is pretty kept together, they just feel just completely different movies. And I can certainly see why someone would prefer, David Cronenberg's The Fly over the original. For me, it's sort of a toss-up. I really do enjoy the 50s version. So pick your poison, both are great. Number 3 on this list is a lot like number 4 in that I have this theory that if you're going to remake a beloved genre classic, you should go and get a master of the genre. With The Fly, they went and got David Cronenberg. That's perfect. Get someone that the fan base trusts to do these films. And the same is true for John Carpenter's The Thing. I know this usually makes a lot of people's number 1, and it has every right to. This is a great film. The original Howard Hawks version is kind of just like a goofy, it's kind of just your run-of-the-mill 1950s sci-fi film with these scientists in Antarctica, and there's an alien running around just kind of chasing them throughout the movie, and it's, kind of obviously lousy effects. Even for the time, it doesn't look that good. And it's just, like I said, your typical monster-on-the-loose 1950s sci-fi film. John Carpenter, who has always been a really big fan of 50s sci-fi, he wanted to remake this movie, but like David Cronenberg, kind of did this body horror version and just completely got rid of the goofy looking alien. And now in John Carpenter's The Thing, it is a shape-shifting, kind of body-snatching alien who you never actually get to see in its true form. It inhabits any living thing and can kind of transform them into these like horrific monsters. Obviously, I think it's everybody's favorite scene when the guy's chest opens up and and then his head comes off and sprouts spider legs and starts running around. I mean, the movie is complete insanity and has easily the best practical effects in any horror movie ever. I think I can pretty comfortably say that. The movie is absolutely phenomenal, and this is one of the few instances where the remake is far superior than the original. Number 2 on my list is just a personal favorite of mine, and it always shocks me that it never gets brought up in this conversation, and that is Tom Savini's 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead. Now, of course, if you've watched any of my videos, or if you're my friend at all, you know that the original 1968 George A. Romero version of Night of the Living Dead is my favorite movie of all time. I think it's one of the most important pieces of cinema ever created. The 1990 version comes nowhere near the level of perfection that the 1968 version is at. But Tom Savini does one hell of a job with this movie. I think that it's, in some aspects, arguably scarier. I think the zombies look great. Tom does a great job also of taking our expectations and knowing how the story goes and turning it on its head. The first time I saw it, I remember being really uneasy because things were different. And that's a good thing, I think, especially with George Romero's blessing, and I believe he even penned the screenplay. So it's hard to go wrong here. I think that this is a great zombie film. I think, like I said, it's scary. I think some of the zombies are really scary in it. The music is really dark and just like the perfect score for this movie. I would love to see somebody release an uncut version of this with some of the effects that were cut out. Savini is, of course, like the master of gore. He's mostly known as a special effects artist and has just made some of the best practical gore effects that have ever been made. I've seen like some behind the scenes footage of like a shotgun blast just disintegrating a zombie's head and stuff, and I wish that was in the version I wish that was in the theatrical version. I know at the time, like in the early 90s, the MPAA was like really strict, and of course they saw George Romero's name and Tom Savini's name and probably just took took a scalpel to it, just sliced the thing up. I would love to see an unrated version released on Blu-ray. This is just a really good film. You know, Tony Todd is one of my favorite actors, and I think he turns out arguably one of his better performances in this movie. It's all around a great film, and it doesn't get the love and appreciation that it deserves. And number 1 on my list of top 5 favorite horror remakes is The Hills Have Eyes. I actually prefer the remake of The Hills Have Eyes to the original. And I love Wes Craven. You know, I think that he's a genius. I love almost every single one of his films. And I'm not saying that the original Hills Have Eyes isn't good, but it's just, for whatever reason, for me, it's just not as fun. It's not as entertaining as the remake. You know, there are a couple things that I think the remake does really well. I like making the family like more mutants that like live in this like old abandoned like artillery shell range out in the desert somewhere, and they're like all mutated from radiation. I think making them mutants and monsters works a little bit better than just rogue bikers. All around, I prefer the remake over the original. On every level, I would say that the remake of The Hills Have Eyes is much better than the original. Just my opinion, you know, you don't have to agree, but that's just where I stand. Well, there you have it, guys. That is my top 5 favorite horror remakes. I hope you weren't too upset by my list there. Let me know in the comments what your favorite horror remakes are, and give some suggestions for some other videos, you know. I was also toying with the idea of doing my top 5 hated horror remakes too, so maybe that one will be coming out in the future. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel and follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, and until next time, guys.